Je donne à présent la parole à Monsieur Mark Lowcock.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. As of this morning, Syrian government authorities have confirmed 256 cases of COVID-19, including 9 fatalities. 6 cases have been recorded in the northeast, including 1 fatality. This is more than a 4-fold increase in recorded cases since my last briefing. So far, overall, infection numbers have thankfully remained low, but this must not be read with too much optimism, since testing remains extremely limited. Little over 8,000 tests have been conducted to date. Moreover, we can see from what's recently been happening elsewhere in the region, including in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and in particular Yemen, the scale of the risks ahead. The United Nations continues to support COVID-19 preparedness and response measures across Syria, including the expansion of testing capacities. But significant gaps remain, including in personal protective equipment, medical case management supplies, and isolation and quarantine capacity. Syria's health system is not prepared for a large-scale outbreak. We need only to look at Yemen to see how quickly COVID-19 can collapse a health system devastated by years of war. Even as the number of recorded infections remains low, the threat of a broader COVID-19 outbreak is aggravating the economic downturn and constraining the humanitarian response. That could have serious consequences across the whole region, not just in Syria. It's in this context that I brief you today on 3 areas. Firstly, the human cost of the current economic downturn. Second, the situation in northwest Syria. And third, the humanitarian response underway from within Syria, including assistance delivered cross-line. Mr. President, prices of food, medicines, fuel, and other essential commodities are soaring across the country. The volatile exchange rate has seen the Syrian pound lose more value in the last 6 months than in the first 9 years of the crisis. This month, the central bank adjusted the official exchange rate from £704 against the US dollar to 1,256 Syria pounds, a 78% devaluation. The unofficial rate fell to its lowest point on record at £3,120 against the dollar. Food prices have consequently reached unprecedented levels. Market monitoring by the UN's World Food Programme shows a 200% increase in the price of the national average food basket since last year. A growing number of Syrians are no longer able to provide for themselves and their families. Many report going into debt and eating less to survive. As I briefed you last month, the World Food Programme now estimates 9.3 million people to be food insecure. That's the highest level ever recorded in Syria, and it's increasing. An estimated 4.6 million children and pregnant and breastfeeding mothers are in need of nutrition assistance. 3.7 million of them are in acute need. We estimate that almost 500,000 children under 5 suffer from stunting, a condition likely to impact irreversibly their physical and cognitive development. Across the country, people who've struggled through 9 years of devastating conflict are telling us they have now reached breaking point. Mr. President, I note again the public assurances by the United States and by the European Union that their sanctions programs relating to Syria neither ban the flow of humanitarian supplies nor target medicines and medical devices. I welcome their commitments to fully and expeditiously apply humanitarian exemptions, and I reiterate again the Secretary-General's appeal for the waiving of sanctions that can undermine countries' capacity to respond to the pandemic. Mr. President, I'm particularly concerned about the situation in the Northwest. An estimated 2.8 million people in the Northwest, 70% of the region's population, require humanitarian assistance. Mass displacement of almost 1 million people earlier this year and new economic hardships aggravated by the regional impact of COVID-19 have left civilians in the northwest among the country's most vulnerable people. Displaced families make up 2/3 of the current population of the northwest. The vast majority of displaced people sheltering in last resort sites are concentrated there. Last resort sites are what we call camps and informal settlements that fall short of even the minimum emergency standards for shelter, water and sanitation. Just last week, rainstorms and flooding in rural Idlib uprooted hundreds of tents and swept away many people's few remaining belongings. In this environment, malnutrition rates have unsurprisingly been rising over the past months. Almost 3 in every 10 children in the northwest under the age of 5 suffer from stunting. Mr. President, under the cross-border operations authorised by this Council under Security Council Resolution 2504, 1,781 aid trucks crossed the border from Turkey into northwest Syria in May. Most of that cross-border aid is food, and it's enough for 1.3 million people every month. Still, more and more children and infants are arriving at nutrition centres showing signs of chronic and acute malnutrition. Mothers arriving at the centres say they have long been priced out of food staples and medicines in the markets, leaving them solely reliant on the food packages delivered across the border. Some say they are also cooking weeds to supplement the food rations. Such is the level of desperation. So I want to be clear that the current levels of assistance delivered across the border are far from sufficient. The Northwest continues to suffer a major humanitarian crisis. The cross-border operation needs to be scaled up further. A failure to extend the cross-border authorization would sever the UN operation currently underway. It would end the UN food deliveries and support to nutrition centres. It would cause suffering and death. Mr. President, as the Secretary General said in his latest report, which you received last week, efforts have been and will continue to be made to deliver cross-line assistance into the Northwest. But at the moment, it's simply impossible to replicate with cross-line assistance what's being delivered through the cross-border operation. Planning has progressed for a cross-line mission to Idlib, which has been on hold since April, when UN movements into the Northwest were paused due to concerns over COVID-19. Our operational planning has now resumed and is proceeding with careful consideration of those risks, as well as the complex security environment. The concept of operations is being finalised to share with the parties. The Secretary General's report further states that continued cross-border operations require a renewal of the authorization for Bab al-Salam and Bab al-Hawa for an additional 12 months. Both border crossings are required to sustain delivery. While the transshipment capacity of Bab al-Salam is lower than that of Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam provides direct access to parts of northern Aleppo that host some of the highest concentrations of displaced people in the country. 1.3 million people live in the area accessed from Bab al-Salam, and 62% of those people are displaced. Mr. President, I turn now to the massive aid operation continuing from inside Syria. In the first 4 months of this year, humanitarian operations inside Syria reached more than 5.5 million people, including cross-line assistance into the northeast. That includes food assistance for 3.2 million, nutrition support for 500,000 children, critical water and sanitation for 1.3 million, 4 million medical procedures, and 2.5 million medical treatment courses. Due to the deteriorating economic situation, we've expanded humanitarian cash assistance. So far this year, more than $40 million worth of cash and vouchers have been distributed to highly vulnerable people, including those living with disabilities, to single-parent households and to the elderly. UNICEF and other education organisations are also supporting students currently taking their national exams across the country by preparing safe examination centres and implementing COVID-19 preventative measures. Thousands of students have been travelling cross-line to government areas, joining 250,000 of their peers to sit their national exams. To the students currently doing that across Syria, I wish you all the very best in your exams. Mr. President, the World Health Organization has dispatched 2 shipments of medical supplies to the northeast overland, in addition to deliveries by air. But more than 5 months on from the renewal of Al Arabiya, distributions of WHO medical items have not reached the majority of facilities that previously depended on supplies delivered cross-border. As the Secretary-General stated in his review of cross-line and cross-border assistance back in February, and as he reiterated in his 67th report on the humanitarian situation in Syria, a combination of more cross-border and cross-line access is required to sustain levels of humanitarian assistance into the northeast and preferably increase that assistance. Should adequate steps not be taken for cross-line deliveries to work effectively, and in the absence of consent from the government of Syria or neighbouring countries to use border crossings into the northeast that are safe and logistically feasible, the Security Council would need to authorise the United Nations and its implementing partners to use additional crossings. Also in the northeast, some 90,000 people remain in overcrowded displacement camps, including at Al-Hol. About 58,000 of them are children, and they are from more than 60 different countries. High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, last week described her concern that thousands of them are unable to return to their countries of nationality or origin. I join her in calling on states to assume responsibility for their nationals in accordance with their obligations under international law. Mr. President, our humanitarian operations in Syria rely heavily on our frontline partners, including national NGOs and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. I call on all parties to facilitate humanitarian access and protect all civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian workers and assets, in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. The humanitarian assistance we provide across Syria also depends on the support of the international community, including the assistance provided by regional neighbours hosting millions of refugees. Tomorrow sees the 4th Brussels conference on supporting the future of Syria and the region, and we'll be asking for this critical support to continue. Mr. President, on 23 June, the Russian Federation informed the United Nations that it will no longer participate in the humanitarian notification system, which the United Nations and its humanitarian partners use to share information with parties to the conflict. We'll discuss the situation further with our humanitarian organisations in Syria and with the Russian Federation. Humanitarian notification, let me remind you, aims to facilitate the delivery safely of humanitarian assistance by informing parties to the conflict of facilities and movements that fulfill a humanitarian function. Whether or not they participate in the humanitarian notification system, parties to the conflict remain bound by international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Mr. President, Security Council Resolution 2504 expires in 11 days. I will close by reiterating the Secretary-General's and my own numerous appeals to extend the cross-border authorization. The cross-border operation provides a lifeline for millions of civilians in northwest Syria. We cannot reach them without it. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur Lowcock de son exposé.